welcome to Dr. Mona, and please tell us your story. We're excited to hear it.
Oh, thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with all of you. I have a special affection for Virginia. So my brother lives in Northern Virginia. I think that's shared in the book. And we are frequent visitors to your beautiful state. So thank you for the work that you are all doing to make it a healthier, cleaner place for all creatures to live in. I'll kind of share a little intro, maybe share a little bit about kind of where Flint is now, and then I'd be happy to entertain any kind of questions or comments or anything that you guys want to ask. So, this book, I didn't, when I went to medical school, I didn't think I was going to write a book. But then again, I didn't think I was going to be like in the center of this really emblematic environmental and public health crisis. And for a long time, I resisted writing the book, and there was so much speed and work and urgency to uncover the crisis. And it was even more after the crisis was uncovered in terms of our work that we are still doing to this day in terms of recovery. But by serendipity and many other reasons, I met my editor, who is a wonderful person who was really committed to social justice stories, really committed to diverse voices in literature. And that really kind of propelled me to share this story and to share a story that I hope you came away reading that wasn't so much about Flint, but really about the Flints everywhere. And you guys know this and see this because you're actively involved in it. But there's injustices, especially environmental injustices, in every community. And it really just takes the power of us to open our eyes. And that's kind of a reflection of the title of What the Eyes Don't See, to open our eyes and to see these injustices, to find a village. And you guys are a village of your peeps who share the same passion to try to work to resolve these injustices. So in a sense, I hope that this book really kind of serves as a playbook on how to make friends, how to build networks, how to strategize, how to use science, how to retain our passion and altruism, especially when it comes to environmental and public health issues. As in the introduction, this this book is weird. It's not just like this thing about what happened in Flint. If you read the first page after the wonderful quote by Dr. Seuss, the first page says, "I am Iraqi, an immigrant born somewhere else." So, this book is also very much a story about me and my family history and my background. And that was not going to be part of this book. It was just going to be a Flint book. But I quickly realized, I can't tell you what I did in Flint and why I'm even in Flint without telling you who I am and where I came from. So it's also kind of a celebration of oral history and family history and really the shoulders that we all stand on that got us to where we are to be able to do what we can do. So that was probably one of the hardest parts about writing this book, is kind of really the weaving of the Flint story with also kind of the personal and the background. I also very much, if you read the book, it's, there's a lot about me and my family and being a mom and having a spouse and also, having a job that was keeping me busy. So that was all included because it was real, but it was also all included to make it as relatable as possible. I'm just another kind of working mom trying to balance all these other things that we're all trying to balance. So I wanted to share that, and I think this is something we've all learned with the pandemic, that this kind of concept of balance doesn't always exist. And that sometimes family's here and sometimes work is here. And we all have to kind of lean on so many kind of layers of support to get through, whatever is in front of us. So that's kind of a little bit about broadly about the story. I would say the hardest part about writing a book, or especially this book, is that, every book has a last page. Every book has the end. And Flint's story wasn't over when this book was done. And it's really not over now either. So that the hardest part was ending the book with a story that hadn't ended. So kind of to tell you where we are now, Flint's pipes are almost replaced, which is amazing. And that what we've done has really kind of had amazing ripple effects across the country. So many other communities are investing in infrastructure, replacing lead pipes, realizing, issues with water, especially drinking water contamination. And I think most kind of the biggest impact of our work is the infrastructure bill, which actually now is the Infrastructure Act that passed and was signed. That is, that includes the largest federal investment in replacing and removing lead pipes. I had the privilege of testifying before Congress just a week ago about, the national effort to replace lead pipes. So that's wonderful. Lots of awesome things have happened. So that's kind of where we are in terms of our water. Our pipes are almost replaced. The water quality is much better. But my work is very much about the kids, leading this initiative to make sure that our kids, have a bright as future as possible for them. And once again, also not just doing it for Flint, but trying to share our best practices to communities all over where children grow up in very similar conditions, be it usurped democracy like we saw in Flint, or systemic inequities, or environmental injustice, or tremendous childhood poverty. These conditions, once again, aren't unique. They too many of our kids grow up in very similar situations, and how can we do better on behalf of all of those children? So we've been able to put into place a lot of awesome that has also had national ripple effects. I'll give you one quick example because I want you guys to ask questions. My clinic, which is above a farmer's market, we see the most kids in the city. We're purposely above a farmer's market to address nutrition insecurity. There's just not many good places to get good food, or have it be affordable for our patients. So every kid that comes in gets a prescription printed just like amoxicillin for healthy fruits and veggies that they fill at our farmer's market, or gets home delivered in this mobile grocery store. And we have academics who assess that, and we've published all these papers, and it's had all these benefits. And because of the success of our program, our U.S. Senator included in the U.S. Farm Bill a nutrition prescription program, which is now federally funded and helps kids all over. So just kind of one example of how our work in Flint, how we've had so many ripple effects, not just around water, but also on what we can do better for so many children out there. So I will stop talking, and I would love to hear any kind of questions or reflections or comments or anything folks want to share.
Great,
yeah, I don't think we have. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Betty.
Oh yeah, thanks. So everyone who has questions or comments, if you look on the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A button, and you can click that, and please put your questions, your comments, whatever you would like to put in there, and Ellie is going to read them out. So while we're waiting for people to think of what their questions are, I have one, which is somewhat in the beginning of the book, you said that if inequality has a favorite season, it's summer. And I found that really sad, but it also, given recent events with COVID, it has struck me that summer has kind of in some ways extended for the last year and a half. And I wondered how the kids are doing with that, what mitigation there may have been to deal with that. So on and so forth.
That's a great question. There's folks who've read this book and they're like, oh my gosh, like, did you know there was going to be a pandemic when you wrote this book? I'm like, no, I didn't predict there was going to be a pandemic, but they're like, but it's like the same kind of issues. It's about, the failure of good governance, and it's about not respecting science, and it's about, the disinvestment in public health infrastructure. And it is about inequities and how burdens, be it environmental or public health burdens, do not fall equally on certain demographics. And this is what we also saw. This is what we saw in the water crisis, and this is kind of what we've seen nationally, especially in the beginning with the pandemic, the kind of the inequities of who's impacted. And when it comes to education, Flint schools are actually still remote right now. Like the achievement gaps that are going to be widened, because of the pandemic, worsened all of the other kind of toxicities that were already there and that were also additive with the pandemic. But I'm a silver linings person. And the really neat thing in Flint is that, after the water crisis, we put into place, like I said, all this awesome stuff. And there's something called the Flint Registry that we run that's funded by the CDC that identifies who was exposed to the water crisis, but more importantly, the purpose of the registry is to get people connected to things like enrichments for their children, home delivery programs for children's books, mental health care, access to a doctor, nutrition services, emergency food. And so we had already built this public health infrastructure to support the people of Flint. And then the pandemic happened. And we're like, oh, these are the same kinds of things people need during the pandemic. They need emergency food. They need mental health and trauma-informed care. They need enrichment for their children. So it kind of really speaks to the benefit of being proactive, of being preventative, and putting in place resources that aren't rocket science. These are resources that everybody needs, that so few communities have access to. So especially in the beginning of the pandemic, when everything was shut down, I was so excited that kids are still getting a book in the mail. We're part of the Imagination Library program run by Dolly Parton. Yay, Dolly Parton. And over 250,000 books have been mailed to Flint kids. They get a book in the mail every month from the age of 0 to 5. So even when everything was shut down, a lot of kids were still getting, access to literature.
Wow, great. Yeah, maybe having it in place ahead of time, was, as you say, a silver lining.
Yeah, one of my colleagues said, the water crisis was just a dress rehearsal for the pandemic. So we had already made partnerships with community agencies. The water hubs became the testing hubs, became the vaccine hubs. So we were able to mobilize a little more readily, and because of just coming off something else.
Oh, great. So,
All right.
do you have some?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in here. So first question is, can you talk a little bit more about the nutrition prescriptions program? Is there a website or a national program?
Yes, that's a great question. So I will put in the chat the link to our website about our nutrition prescription program. The national program is run by the USDA, and it's called I'm gonna get it wrong. I think it's like the Gus Schumacher nutrition program or something. So states have to apply to be part of it. So it's not something. Oh, I totally texted you something. All right, put the wrong thing. Hold on, I got to put it for everybody. But I will include more information about our program. But this is kind of gaining momentum. The interest in nutrition prescription programs. There's a lot of foundation support. There's even now a lot of conversations that, with health plans to reimburse nutrition, food, as similarly as they do with other kind of, medications and what have you.
Okay, so next question is, what was the most difficult issue to overcome in working towards health equity in Flint? Big question.
Well, that is a great question. And we're absolutely still working towards health equity. This is long-term work. And I think the biggest issue that we address every day is the issue of trust. And I think this was, kind of people were more aware of trust in the pandemic and people's mistrust of vaccines and trust of certain information and science. And I think for us in Flint, it's more acute because, the folks in Flint went through a water crisis where they were told to trust the water, that it was safe, right? For a year and a half, they were told, like, yeah, the water is safe. And there was amazing people who were loud and they were organized and, they were raising concerns. They're like, no, everything's okay. Trust us. We're the folks in charge. Trust us. We're the scientists, trust us. And then, they were lied to. They were betrayed literally, by the folks that we as taxpayers tax dollar support to keep us healthy and safe and make sure our water's clean. So that trust was shattered. And it wasn't just shattered at the water crisis. Like in this book, there's a lot of history in this book. I'm a huge fan of history. Like, it is impossible possible for us to move forward and fix big problems without starting by looking back and figuring out how we got here. So there was long-standing kind of corrosion of trust, a long-standing neglect and indifference and systemic racism. And then the water crisis happened. And so for some folks, when the water crisis happened, they're like, oh, see, I told you, like, they're trying to eradicate us. They're trying to get rid of us. This was purposeful. This was a genocide. So the hardest part moving forward has been to rebuild trust, and that there's many ways that needs to happen. And there needs to be long-term resources, and I talked about all these different things that we're doing. They need to be supported for a long time. Part of rebuilding trust is also efforts at truth and accountability and justice and restorative justice. All of these things are critical to restore trust and to try to get to a point of health equity. And I never used to kind of address these issues, especially the issues of like justice and who should go to jail and what would be appropriate, like a settlement, what could be an appropriate damages for somebody. And I've come to realize how important it is to have a reckoning with injustices. And I'm not just talking about Flint now, like as a nation, as communities all over, there's injustices, historic injustices in so many of our communities that we've never come to terms with. And for me as a doctor, I think about that as like an open wound. Like if we can never reconcile, apologize, reckon the past injustice, it's very hard for us to move on and to heal from those kinds of traumas. So there's a lot of ways that we can help get to a place of trust, but it takes time and it takes resources, it takes rapport building, and it absolutely doesn't happen overnight.
Right. Okay, so I think next question is, how were adults specifically affected by lead, and mothers in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I got a lot of pushback in the beginning. People are like, you only care about kids. Like, everybody drank this water. And that is true. Everybody drank this water and everybody was impacted. However, lead is a neurotoxin. It attacks especially the developing brain. And that's why we worry about kids the most, because they're most vulnerable to addiction, and they can, really suffer the lifelong consequences. You give a kid and adult the same amount of lead, a kid will absorb more and have more of these potential long-term consequences. But adults are not immune. Adults will, can still manifest, especially at higher doses. And I would add, some of the first concerns that there was something wrong with our water came from pets. It came from the animals. So the animals, the dogs and the cats, were often drinking water that we were given to them from non-potable water sources, like the laundry tub sink or some other sink where there might've been a higher lead content and thus higher leaching into the water. So, animals were getting sick and people had a lot of concerns about that. MSU, Michigan State University's vet school, came in and did animal testing and brought in resources also for pets. There's a great movement called, I think it's called One World, where, we don't just think about humans, we think about all creatures and the impact all of these bad environmental things can have on all creatures, and often with animals, they're, they can show symptoms earlier and be more susceptible to environmental contamination because they're often lower to the ground and more exposed to different things. So everybody was exposed. Everybody was impacted. Women, you talked, I think it was pregnant women. So there's, it's kind of well studied, the known kind of maternal fetal complications of lead. I think I mentioned this in the book. There was a village in northern England, Sheffield, England, which is actually where I was born. And in the 1890s, they noticed that there was a lead and water disaster, and they noticed that a lot of pregnant moms lost their babies. And because of that, one of the first abortion pills cited in the medical literature in the British Medical Journal was a lead-based pill to induce abortions. So lead is well known to cause fetal death and miscarriages and preeclampsia and small birth weight and all these other problems as well. So there's a lot of potential long-term manifestations. The thing with lead, just like many environmental health things, is that there's often a kind of a time lag between exposure and manifestation. And that's why this registry is so important. It provides kind of the surveillance to see how people are doing over time. The CDC has just kind of renewed our funding. So we're excited because we have another 5 years of funding to once again longitudinally follow folks. But this is not just surveillance. The beauty of our work is to see how folks are doing, but more importantly, get them connected to resources that we talked about, like nutrition and mental health care and doctors and developmental assessments and all these things to support them.
Right, and on that note, actually, someone had a question about how you're tracking the long-term effects and recovery using that registry.
Yeah, I would check out flintregistry.org. We just released our inaugural report. It's a voluntary survey. Once again, we struggle with the issues of trust, but the really neat thing is all the work that we do in Flint is hand in hand with community. It is about being kind of working humbly, shoulder to shoulder with our community partners. That's important in any community, the need to work together with community, but it's really important in places like Flint where our democracy was taken away, where we were under this kind of bizarre state of emergency management, and the voices of the community were dismissed and denied and minimized. So part of our recovery is this concept of participatory democracy and self-determination. So that's why all of the work that we do is definitely, once again, hand in hand in community. And I just want to touch on this because I think it often gets lost in the story is that in addition to it being an environmental story and a science story and a girls are awesome story and all these other parts of this awesome story, it's also a story about what happens when we take away democracy. So, Flint was in this kind of state of, emergency management. The state was running, the local folks had no control, and it was happening throughout our state, where the central government, the governor was taking over majority minority cities, and at one point in Michigan, half of our African American population was under emergency management compared to just 2% of our white population. So this was the first big story that came out of Flint, this bizarre story of usurped democracy. And this is not how American cities are supposed to be run. And I share this because I want people to kind of take home that, hey, this is not just happening in Flint. Like these things that are happening right now with like voter ID laws and voter suppression and gerrymandering, like these are also kind of things that are corroding democracy, that are taking away often minority voices and kind of what they're saying in government.
Our next question is kind of still in the vein of trust. You talked about how you thought the people protecting us and our air and water were a bunch of scientists in a lab, but that obviously wasn't true. And has that changed at all?
Yeah, so there's amazingly good people that work in all of these bureaucracies at every level of government. And I've met hundreds of them, and they want to do their job and they don't want to do a great job. And often it's impossible for them to do their job because we haven't, or society or government hasn't supported them. So I think one of the lessons of Flint is how through so many kind of years and decades of austerity, we've made it very difficult for folks who need to protect our public health and our environment to do their job. One of the first reports that came out of Flint said that, it was the attacks on big government that left these bureaucracies like skeletons of what they used to be, and no longer could they be proactive, and they were mainly reactive, and they were mainly rubber stamps. So kind of let this be a lesson of the need to invest in public health, make sure that our agencies have what they need to do their job. And when they don't, demoralizing. It's, you know, it's very, very, very difficult. So I think that's one of the reasons I also want people to go away remembering, or, you know, reiterating that I think a lot of people, when they hear the Flint story, they're like, oh, this is a failure of government. That's part of it, but it's also a story of what happens when government works. Yeah. For example, when our US senators and our US Congress people who were still, you know, representing Flint, and our state legislators, when they found out the scope of what was happening, they never stop fighting for Flint. And for me, that reiterates how important it is to have whole democracies, transparent representative democracies, and the power of electing folks who do serve as true public servants. So, you know, yes, there were some issues, but primarily those issues were because of chronic disinvestment in public health, in government and regulations that keep people healthy, and also because of the corrosion of democracy.
Next question is, how are some of the children, especially babies who are affected by lead in the water, doing currently without disclosing any obviously personal information?
That's a great question. So that's, you know, I can tell you how some kids I just saw in clinic are doing. I'm still seeing patients, but that's not what you want to know. You want to know how the population of children is doing. And that's what the Flint Registry is trying to answer, is how the population of kids are doing in, you know, in kind of in ways that are comparable to the rest of the population. So we are starting to get some of those results back. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of ongoing needs, especially when it comes to development and behavior and nutrition and health needs. So there's a lot of issues. We've been able to enroll about almost 20,000 people in the Flint Registry. And the really neat thing is that of those people, we've made referrals to about 25,000 different agencies, trying to fill gaps and meet needs. So it's doing what it was built to do, but you know, kind of time will tell. It'll, in some sense, it will be impossible to answer that question, because right when the water crisis happened, we didn't sit back and wait. Let's see what happens to the kids. Our focus was on, let's roll up our sleeves and put into place everything we know science tells us can help these kids. And that's what we did. So, you know, whatever we end up seeing, you know, in the back of my head, I wonder how worse it would have been if we didn't do anything, if we sat back and didn't put in place the literacy programs and the mental health care and the nutrition services and all these awesome things that we've been working to put into place.
Next question is, how would you discuss Flint and the whole issue with students, especially like young students who it might be scary to talk about with?
Yeah, I talk to students all the time. I love talking to students. I think it's the educator in me, the professor in me. So, you know, I talk to Girl Scouts, I talk to elementary school kids, I talk to all kinds of kids, and I tell them, you know, that the water was making people sick, and it would have gone on for a long time if it wasn't for a brave group of people that came together and asked questions and used science to figure out something was wrong. And they kept speaking and speaking. They didn't give up. They were persistent, and they created change. So that's kind of in my very basic pediatrician words. So I tell kids that, you know, I tell kids, just like I tell adults, like, this is a story about keeping our eyes open, about making friends, especially with people who are different than us, and how when we work together, we can change things and we can make something, you know, that, you know, we can make things better for especially, you know, those who are more vulnerable. So, you know, we have amazing kids in Flint. I have a group of kids that are part of my initiative. We have a kids advisory board. They've named themselves the Flint Youth Justice League. So they've actually been advising other kids in other communities that are going through similar like water issues. So our kids, you know, our kids are leaders, and they're also kind of sharing the story, but sharing it as an example of how to persevere and how to persist, and how, you know, how science and advocacy can make and teamwork can make a difference. I'll give you one story. We had a group of fourth graders in Flint conduct some of the experiments in the water. And, these fourth graders, took Flint water and they took Great Lakes water, and they noticed that in the Flint water, like nails were corroding a lot faster than in the Great Lakes water. And they shared the science, and the state said, oh, that science is too complicated and too expensive. We couldn't have done it. I'm like, fourth graders did this science. So our kids are smart. Our kids are so smart. Sometimes we just need to sit back and listen to them.
This is actually a comment, not a question, but Linda McDaniel says that she's a public school teacher, and one of her favorite quotes is from your book is, "The eyes can't see what the mind doesn't know," which is an awesome quote.
Thank you. Yes, and she corrected me. It's One Health, not One World. One World is actually the name of my publisher.
Oh, very good. So I think the next question is there a program for treating people in Flint for lead toxicity like they're doing for California condors?
Not really. So like, obviously, that's the problem with lead. The treatment is prevention. If somebody has a super high level where they need medical care, there's things like chelation, but that doesn't impact the long-term consequences. It doesn't change the neurodevelopmental consequences. The treatment is prevention. And it's this concept in public health called primary prevention, where you're not supposed to expose a population to lead in the first place. And that's kind of what we failed to do in Flint. I mean, what we fail to do everywhere. The kids all over continue to be exposed to lead. So what we've been able to put in place is secondary prevention, where we are smothering children, especially, with all these other resources to promote health and development. We can't take away the exposure, but we can do a lot that science tells us to mitigate the impact of the exposure.
The next question is, have chloramines been a big problem in other places besides Washington, D.C.? Our local water authority wanted to start using chloramines, but after a public outcry, went with activated charcoal treatment instead.
Yeah, so chloramines was the culprit in the DC lead and water crisis. So the switch from chlorine to chloramine to decrease the amount of disinfectant byproducts that chlorine was causing, and that which are carcinogens, cause cancer, but chloramine caused the corrosion that put the lead in the water in the DC water crisis. I don't know how many other communities have used chloramine and have had, potential other consequences. But what I do know is, that our current drinking water regulations have an opportunity for improvement, especially when it comes to lead and water. The lead and water rule is called the lead and copper rule. It was recently revised. It's improved, but there's, what I've come to realize, we were never really guaranteed lead-free water, and there's not even a health standard for it. So there's a long way, a lot of work that needs to be done to really catch our policies up with science.
The next question in the Q&A is, as a physician, what approaches have you found helpful for overcoming vaccine hesitancy in Flint communities that may have developed from a history of legitimate distrust in medical and government systems?
That's a great question. So I co-chair our state's kind of vaccine commission as like this trusted voice, trying to encourage folks to get vaccinated. But as the question kind of alluded to, there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of historic distrust, there's a lot of abuses, especially from medicine and government, that have rightly caused these distrusts. Tuskegee, Henry Elects, the list goes on of kind of reasons why folks shouldn't trust government. And obviously the Flint story. So what do I do as a physician? I sit and I listen. There isn't vaccines are bread and butter. What I do as a pediatrician, that's everything that we do. Almost every visit involves vaccines. And I sit and I answer questions. I don't want a parent to just say, yes, give me all those vaccines. I want them to have questions. I don't want blind trust. I want to a healthy dose of mistrust. I want families to come to me with concerns, as they should, like, you know, what is this vaccine for, and what's in this, and what is it preventing? And we have conversations, and we sit and we build rapport, and they may not, you know, they might not say yes that first visit, but maybe when the baby comes back at the next visit, you know, maybe they'll say yes. So building trust involves listening, and listening to concerns, and not judging, and, you know, trying to provide credible resources. I often share, you know, what the vaccine is preventing. I talk about the consequences of not getting the vaccine. I talk about cases I've seen, like babies with pertussis who just stop breathing because, you know, they can't, you know, they just, that's what it does to babies who are unvaccinated, you know, or other cases that, you know, that of things that we're preventing. And then I often share, you know, I, as a mother, you know, my kids have also gotten this vaccine. And often that's like, what is like, oh, okay, if you've given it to your kids, then, you know, I think it's safe. So these are kind of the conversations I had pre-COVID, you know, so very similar conversations post-COVID. However, I haven't been as successful with convincing people to get the COVID vaccine. What we're seeing in medicine, and as we're seeing nationally, is not as much vaccine hesitance, but there's a lot of vaccine resistance. And there's folks that no matter what you say, they're not gonna trust. And you can, you know, I keep trying. I'll share information. I talk about, you know, what it's preventing and how kids have gotten sick. And then I also share, even with the COVID vaccine, I'm like, and even, you know, my kids have gotten the vaccine too. And I knew that in this kind of era of mistrust and misinformation, I knew I needed to like show people that my kids have gotten the vaccine. So actually on the first day that the vaccine was approved for 12 to 15-year-olds, my kids were on live TV, like getting their vaccine. So they were kind of voluntold. And you know, you could see the shot go in their arm. Like, look, Dr. Mona's kids even got this vaccine. She trusts it. Her kids got it on TV. So, you know, some of these things work for some people, that it doesn't work for a lot of people, but I think there's a lot that we need to do to kind of combat the not only lost trust, but the kind of the disrespect of science. And, you know, we saw that in the Flint story. That's also one of the reasons I wrote this book, is to share kind of really the consequences to public health when we don't listen to science and scientists.
I think that's the last question I see for now, but please don't hesitate to put any more questions in the Q&A.
Oh, all right. You guys are awesome.
Thanks so much for joining us. That was just amazing. Do you have any sort of parting encouraging words to get us to address issues as we see them, what our eyes do see?
Well, I think something I often tell like college students, I share my 4 Ps with them. So like, what, you know, the first one is passion. Like, what are you guys passionate about? And you guys have your passions, they're articulated. You know, what do you guys care about? What keeps you up at night? And it's hard. There's so many things and so many injustices to see, and it's overwhelming and exhausting to care about everything. So like, find a passion. And you guys seem to have narrowed your passions. And then I think one of the lessons of the story that I already shared before is find your people, and find your village. This work is impossible alone. This work is possible because of a team. So stay connected, find your village. Is also unexpected. Like, I never expected my best friend in the story to be a water engineer from Virginia. And my best friend was a water engineer. So find your friends in unexpected places. Make your team big and diverse. And then my next kind of P tip is be persistent. You know, change happens in windows, and we never know when change is going to happen. So keep at it. Do not give up. Be loud and annoying and pleasant, and you know, all these different things at different times with different people with our work. So be persistent. And then my last P of advice is be prepared. I think there's a line in my book, something like, I was the right person at the right place with the right team, but the right training. I'd had kind of the training in environmental health and science and analysis and advocacy and and media training and all these different things that helped me do what I'm doing. So having a coalition and network like you do right now, that's about being prepared. Fighting another issue that may not seem as big a deal is going to prepare you for the next big thing. Organizing, being a facilitator, like, Ellie's asking all these great questions. She's, that's being prepared to be a leader. All of you guys, everything that we do, and it's often we don't realize this, is preparing us for something. So take advantage of kind of opportunities that may come your way. And lastly, and this is not a P, and maybe I can make it into a P, the way that we see things, or we're helped to see things, is by supporting journalists, by supporting especially kind of investigative journalists, eyes on the ground that bring stories to light. The unsung heroes of the Flint story were these amazing dogged journalists who kept asking questions and digging. So subscribe to your local paper, national papers, whatever, to help put more of those eyes on the ground.
I see one more question in the chat, actually. Has your work had any international impact, since we suspect these problems are worldwide, obviously?
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, did you say international or national? International.
Sorry.
I don't know. It's definitely, there's been quite a few ripple effects, mostly national. It's interesting. We got a lot of international help ourselves. So other countries, especially like what we consider developing countries, were coming to us and telling us how we can treat our water, or how we can build water reclamation systems, or how we can do things because of our water issue. So a lot of folks, in the international world were giving us tips. And, I can't tell you, like, I was just in a kind of I was asked to help. There's a case in was it South Africa about a kind of a lead smelter with these villages of poisoned kids, and they used a lot of kind of the precedent in Flint, especially for our settlement, to try to kind of support these kids who are poisoned by this kind of lead mine or something. So I think there has been some international impact, but I would say by far the impact has been nationally, and it's been quite significant.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your stories with us. That was really, really great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I hope you guys enjoyed the book.
Oh yeah.
Yes, we definitely did.
Awesome.
It was good. Yes. Bye. So I'm gonna just quickly put up what our next events are for anyone that is still here. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Okay, are you guys seeing that? I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you guys see? So I just want to tell you that our next two upcoming events are on March 10th, which is a webinar on how to write effective public comments. So this is a way in which that we can contribute to problems that we see, is by writing to people, and this webinar should help to give us some of the tools to make sure that when we are writing something, it's actually going to really help. And then in continuing with our theme of, so something I forgot to mention in the beginning is that this is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And although the Flint water crisis probably had more to do with the Safe Drinking Water Act, in all cases, we have these acts that are meant to protect us, to protect water. And it's good to explore the promise of those acts and also the failures of those acts. And so our book clubs this year will be focusing on water in all different ways. And our next one, which kind of follows on Flint, is a book called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. One of the great ironies of the Flint water crisis was that they have poor drinking water when you're in a state that is on the Great Lakes, which contain 20% of the fresh water in the world, is just really, really sad. The Death and Life of the Great Lakes focuses more on the issues of the biology and quality of water in those waterways. So we'll be getting together again in a month to talk about that book. You'll be getting an email pretty soon with the information about how to sign up for that. And the last thing I just wanted to show you was that I thought this was sort of cool. I wanted to see, what had happened after Flint. And just recently, there have been articles about the Biden administration and its plan to get rid of all of the lead pipes in the United States. The cost of this would be about $60 billion. $60 billion has not been approved in the budget, but at least it's a goal and it's a start. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about the article is that it says the science on lead is settled. There is no safe level of exposure, which is exactly what we read about in the book. So thank you all for coming. It was great to hear from Dr. Mona, and I'm sure that you all enjoyed it, and I hope that we'll see you next time. Bye.
Great job, everyone.